as they were breaking up all the monasteries and consolidating the power in the hands of the monarchy to direct the empire, I think. And then about 100 years later, we had an English civil war, with between Charles I and Oliver Cromwell. And this was because Charles I had seen the symptoms of the beginnings of the creation of empire in lots and lots of destitute people who'd been evicted in the enclosures from the countryside and were being forced to go and work in cheap labor, building all the equipment for the empire, ships and all this sort of thing, and work in cities for the industrialists. And Charles I said, no, you're not going to do this. We can't have families living in ditches in the countryside. And so he stopped all that. And that's why, really, I think that was precipitated the Civil War, because he was fining all these merchants that were enclosing land and evicting people. And that was really the beginning of urbanization. As those enclosures happened, we started to have mass urbanization in Britain more quicker than anywhere else. Anyway, the rest is history. Charles I lost his head, and the merchant classes basically took over during the Civil War from the feudal system that had been put there by the Normans. So as time went on, obviously the empire expanded. The British sent their ships out, bullying everybody. First of all, it's very much like the Phoenician Empire, actually, from literally like 1000 BC. Is they would go out, start trading, make friends, and then infiltrate and take over. So the Phoenicians did exactly the same as the British were doing. So Dee, I think, was borrowing quite a bit from the old Phoenician Empire. They were basically like an intelligence service for the Egyptian pharaohs back in those days. Anyway, we don't want to go quite that far back. And so as time progressed, the British started taking over more and more. And I think the next important stage was Cecil Rhodes and the will of Cecil Rhodes, because he had become incredibly wealthy through the colonization of Southern Africa. And he had decided with some of his mates, a round table, he called it, that Britain could now prepare to take over the world. And so in his will, he wrote a whole load of money to go to these basically secret societies, creation of things like the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States, as it eventually became, and Chatham House in central London, which were private foreign policy think tanks. Now, the idea is that the capitalist class can just funnel loads of its money into these private foreign policy think tanks and get what it wants. And so this is how Cecil Rhodes then thought, well, we're going to take over everything now. And they started to do that. Obviously, the British Empire became it was modeled, Adil, I think, on the Roman Empire. The idea really was, they borrowed from a lot of people, the Phoenicians and the Romans, but the eventual outcome of it was that they co-opted local leaders, as you know, in India and what is now Pakistan. The idea was, we'll find friendly locals, just as the Romans did when they came to invade Britain in 43 AD. We'll find some cooperative locals, put them in charge. What we'll do is we'll then institute a reasonably fair system of justice, and everyone will start to love us. And of course, actually, that they did. A lot of people found their living standards increasing under the Roman Empire, and systems of justice being instituted around the world under the British. So it wasn't all about just extracting wealth, but the British didn't want trouble. They just want the wealth to flow nice and easy out of the country to them. And so Cecil Rhodes, I suppose, embodied this bigger attempt, which was world domination. And that's where it all came unstuck. So fast forward on to the Second World War, where it all started changing. I mean, the First World War, I think we can see really as a family squabble between the Russian Tsar, Kaiser Wilhelm, and King George in Britain. They were basically all cousins, and they all fell out. And so we had a horrific war. But the outcome of the war was absolutely clear. The First World War, Allenby, he swept up right the way through Palestine at the last 2 years of World War I. And then literally, as soon as he removed the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, from Palestine, then they signed the armistice. And this is when the stage at which the Balfour Declaration was published. So World War I, you can look upon as really just a kind of cover operation for the British taking over Palestine in order to then, a few years later, hand it over to the Israelis in World War II. So that's a kind of I mean, in a nutshell, that for a lot of people, particularly in the Middle East, they're now looking at World War I and World War II as revolving around actually the creation of this Crusader state that we now have, which goes back even further, doesn't it, to the old Crusades? Look, so anyway,
another fault line left of the colonial legacy.
Absolutely right. Yeah, and this is what they do all the time. This was arranged with the French, of course, through the Sykes-Picot Agreement, secret agreement, which we only know about that because of the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. The Bolsheviks said, "Oh, look at this interesting agreement. I didn't know about this." So they published the Sykes-Picot Agreement for the world to see. And of course, the British and the French went, "Oh, sorry, we didn't really want people to know about that." And so that's how they divided up the Middle East. And I think if you go, sort of more up to date, the Americans have basically the British lost the Second World War. They lost their empire. They lost we've lost our industry now, although I think that's probably more to do with the City of London. But the Americans then took over. So the idea is, like you say, when you leave, you always try to leave all sorts of problems. Think about Saudi Arabia and Yemen, for example. There's another problem. The British left Yemen in the 1960s. A friend of mine was a soldier over there. And we left without really hardly any shots being fired compared to the recent horrific slaughter of the Yemenis by the British and the Saudis that we've seen. And so these fault lines were left all over the place. The idea is, this is a sort of divide and rule tactic, isn't it? So you have a neo-colonial IMF and financial empire where you get your local natives who are now running things. This is after World War II, into debt, and then you control them through debt relief. So you say, if you do this, we'll give you another tranche of money from the IMF. And that's what they've been doing all over the world. Now, that's now being contested, of course, in Africa quite a lot. Countries have realized what they're up to. And so the European powers and the Americans are slowly but surely being elbowed out of Africa, quite right too.
Mm-hmm. So Tony, just a bit more about the UK's and the US relationship in this particular scene, this particular geopolitical, the new empire, the neo-colonization through there was this very famous book by John Perkins. I don't know if you read it or not, The Confessions of an International Economic Hitman. So by placing international economic hitmen around the globe, they've been controlling it, and it is being contested by various organizations. Gaddafi tried to do it. We all know what happened to him. But let's not go there. But what's happening right now, let's stick to the current affairs. The U.S. financial hegemony is being challenged by countries like BRICS, by China, Russia, India, South Africa, combined together. Of course, they're a long way off from what they're planning to do. But do you think is it a serious threat, firstly? But more importantly, what is the UK's role in playing a bridge between the US hegemony to the rest of the world and employing the divide and rule tactics or the fault lines left behind? And is the UK still effective? Is the UK benefiting? Are the people in the UK benefiting from this tactic or not, or the strategy?
No, not in any way. Look, the life in Britain has been going down through the floor. Really, the standard of living, the disposable income here is appalling. So, when I was growing up in the early 1970s, it was fairly easy to get any job. A job would pay the mortgage, electricity bill, and the housewife could stay at home, no problem, all this sort of thing. So now you've got to get two parents really, like, as soon as they're thinking, can I afford to have a child? If they have a child, then they've immediately got to go out and get two jobs. Look, it's been an absolute disaster economically. But more, what you're asking about the United States and Britain, I go back to Cecil Rhodes, because these organizations which he's created, and of course in many other countries across Europe mainly too, the Institutes for International Affairs are working extremely closely together. In fact, it's really a sort of secret network. That's how Cecil Rhodes wanted it to work. And so the British and the Americans, there's also Carroll Quigley is a very important author. One of his books is called The Anglo-American Establishment, and it looks at the power elite in London and in the United States. And remember, Britain created the United States, really. I mean, actually, what you're talking to me in the city of Bristol, which is where John Cabot sailed in 1497 out to Newfoundland, and he did another trip a couple of years later, so-called discovering America, when of course it had already been discovered quite a long time previously by all the Native Americans. And then I call it a reconnaissance for genocide, because, and I'm not kidding, around about 50 million Native Americans were killed by the European powers, mainly the Brits, in taking over North America and creating this new world, so-called New World Order, United States, that we now see. And the power the United States now wields is absolutely far, far greater than what the Nazis had in the 1930s and 1940s. And of course, they've got a similar attitude, which shouldn't be too surprising, because so many Nazis in Operation Paperclip went over to the United States. So the Americans seem to think that they can intervene and bomb and invade any country that they want. And so this is Britain's poison child. I think the Americans are sort of a bit beholden to the Brits as any colonial power. I mean, so for example, when I visit New Zealand or Australia, they're all sort of a little bit like, oh, you're from England, the mother country. Well, no, not really. Actually, the natives here are really the indigenous people here, and you're sort of ex-colonists. So, I mean, one thing has been quite good is the English language. I think is a useful tool in order to help understand. I see, for example, people like RT. They do some stuff. They don't translate the major speeches of their leaders, their advisors, etc., apart from Zakharova, into English. And you think, well, why on earth not? Because this is exactly what the BBC want. They just don't. They want to look at your thing and say, oh, we can't play that because it's not in English, and we have to translate it, and that's too much bother. So English is, I think, the language in which the future is being discussed, and the various problems in the world are being sorted out. But yeah, we're very close to the Americans, and particularly at the what I call tampon Charlie level. Now, I've got not very much respect for King Charles. I think there's been a massive change, Adil, in this country. When the Queen died, she is quoted as saying, I do not trust any Israeli because they're either a terrorist or the son of a terrorist. That's the words of Elizabeth II. And she wouldn't let any of the Israelis into any of her palaces for events and that sort of thing. She didn't trust them. She knew people who had been killed by Israeli terrorists in the 1940s, for example. Very personal friends of hers had been blown up by the Zionists' terror gangs. And but now she's gone. And in fact, it was amazing when she died, the funeral cortege that went, it was supposed to go through the whole country, but Charles decided to fly it down to London. And I think it should have really gone through the whole country, really, by road, slowly. And then they drove it from central London up to, I think it was to Windsor, for her to be buried. And to see all the people come out and say goodbye, it was like we were saying goodbye to an era where Britain had kind of got out of empire. We decided, right, we're not going to be an empire anymore, but we still had a lot of the socialist values from the post-war era, which were, we look after the poor, we look after the mentally ill, we pay for them, and the government serves the people in this country. It's a proper Christian country where you put others before yourself, and the government's doing that. Now, to see the Queen going to Windsor to be buried, I think was that was the end of that era. And Charles is a different person completely. As you can see, he's not hands off. He gets involved in a lot of these negotiations, for example, with the nuclear powers in Europe threatening Russia. He's hands on with all this sort of thing. And so, that. And also, of course, the US establishment is very, very close to Charles, as is the Canadian establishment. These people are all good friends, and they're all agreed that what Israel is doing is right, whereas the rest of the country thinks it's wrong. And the same, I think, mostly with Russia. A lot of the public opinion is anti-Russia, but anyone that knows what's going on knows that there has been assaults on the Russian state ever since the era of Napoleon. Hitler, it was the latest massive attack on Russia. And so the Russians, yes, they invaded Ukraine, but they invaded the Russian part of Ukraine, which was separated. So we go back